A Captain Worth Finding, written by Violet Sinclair, narrated by Isadora Blythe. Chapter 1, 40 feet. James Sears was 40 feet up in the rigging and climbing higher. Emma gripped the base of the mainmast, the tarred rope biting into her palms, the sharp stink of pitch and salt and coal smoke filling her nose as she tilted her head back against the Atlantic glare. The wind snapped at her skirts and whipped loose strands of hair across her face. And none of that mattered because the 18-year-old heir to Sears shipping was dangling above the ocean like a boy who believed the world would always catch him. James? She kept her voice pitched to carry without shouting. Years of managing other people's children had taught her the precise volume that commanded attention without provoking panic. James William Sears, you will come down this instant. He didn't look down. He was grinning. She could see it even at this distance, that reckless flash of teeth that was pure Charlotte in a William-shaped frame. A young sailor on the yardarm was laughing, which meant he'd either dared James up or failed to stop him. Emma noted the sailor's face and filed it away. She filed everything away. It was an old governess habit, and it had outlasted the job by years. James, your mother can see the deck from the saloon windows. That got his attention. His head swiveled downward, and for one lurching moment his foot slipped against the ratlines. Emma's stomach dropped through the deck. I'm perfectly well, Emma. He was grinning down at her, 18 years old and still convinced the world arranged itself for his convenience. The view is extraordinary. I can see a young man who is about to give his father a heart attack on top of a dying grandfather. Come, down. Rose appeared at Emma's elbow, slightly breathless. The captain's coming. Quickly? Running. Good, because Emma had calculated exactly how long she could keep James talking before his arms gave out, and the number wasn't generous. Captain Hale arrived without announcement. One moment the quarterdeck was empty, and the next a tall figure in a dark coat was striding past her toward the mast, already shrugging off his jacket. He was younger than she'd expected a captain to be, with a weathered face and hands that looked like they'd been built from rope and salt water. He didn't ask what had happened. He looked up, assessed the situation in the span of a breath, and went up after James. Fast, sure-footed, his body remembering the rigging the way her hands remembered piano keys. Emma watched him ascend, hand over hand, boots finding footholds without searching for them. And something beneath her terror registered that she'd never seen anyone move with such certain grace. He reached James in less than a minute. She couldn't hear what he said, but she watched James's grin fade and his posture change, the reckless bravado draining out of him like water from a cracked cup. They came down together. The captain descended first, staying close enough to catch James if he slipped, guiding without touching. When James's boots finally hit the deck, Emma's knees nearly buckled with relief. The young sailor who'd been laughing on the yardarm was no longer laughing. Captain Hale dismissed him with a look that could have stripped varnish, then turned that look on James, who had the sense to stare at his shoes. Mr. Sears. The captain's voice was low, controlled, and absolutely furious. You are not a member of my crew. You are a passenger aboard a vessel your father owns, and you have just endangered yourself, distracted my men, and demonstrated a staggering contempt for the safety of everyone aboard this ship. You will go below, and you will stay below until I send word that you may return to the deck. Is that understood? James, white-faced now that the thrill had worn off, nodded once and disappeared down the companionway without argument. Rose followed him, not because Emma asked her to, but because Rose had already assessed that James needed supervising and decided to handle it herself, which left Emma alone on deck with a furious captain and the Atlantic wind and the shaking she'd been holding off for the last 10 minutes. Captain Hale turned on her. Miss Lane. Captain, your charge nearly killed himself. I'm aware. He had no business in the rigging, none whatsoever. The captain's jaw was tight, his eyes hard beneath brows that looked permanently set against wind and weather. He was taller than she'd realized. She had to tilt her head back to hold his gaze, which irritated her. The Liverpool accent, usually trained to near invisibility, had roughened with anger. What kind of governess allows a grown man to... The kind who knows that shouting at a frightened boy 40 feet in the air makes him fall faster, Captain. The words came out sharper than she'd intended. She watched them land, watched his expression shift from anger to something more complicated, a recalibration behind those steady, unreadable eyes. He wasn't frightened. He simply didn't know it yet. Emma held his gaze because looking away would mean admitting that her hands were trembling and her heart was hammering, and the last 10 minutes had taken years off her life. May I suggest that in future, if a boy I've known his whole life does something foolish, you direct your anger at him rather than at the woman who was talking him down before you arrived. A muscle worked in his jaw. He was not, she suspected, a man accustomed to being corrected. Captains weren't. They occupied the same untouchable authority aboard their ships as earls did in their estates, absolute, unquestioned, and deeply affronted when challenged by the help. The rigging is my responsibility. His voice had cooled, but the heat was still there underneath. James Sears is mine. She matched his tone exactly, and I had the situation in hand. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The wind filled the silence between them with the crack of canvas and the groan of timber, and somewhere below decks, Kate Sears was probably writing in her notebook that the rigging incident had cost the ship 40 minutes of adjusted heading time, because Kate noticed everything and forgave nothing. Captain Hale held her gaze for a beat longer than was comfortable. Then he turned, retrieved his jacket from the deck, shrugged it on, and walked back toward the quarterdeck without another word. Emma stayed where she was until he was gone. Then she pressed her back against the mainmast, wrapped her arms around herself, and let the trembling come. Below her feet, the engines hummed their low, steady vibration through the deck planking, the heartbeat of a ship that never stopped, never rested, never let you forget you were suspended above 1,000 fathoms of nothing. She'd kept her voice steady, she'd kept her spine straight, she'd kept every particle of terror locked behind the composure that was the only currency she'd ever had. Nobody saw her shaking. But when she finally straightened and turned toward the companionway, she caught a glimpse of the captain on the quarterdeck. He was watching her, not with anger, not with the dismissal she'd expected, with something she couldn't name and didn't have time to examine. Something warm flickered beneath her ribs, entirely uninvited. She crushed it before it could take shape. She was 29 years old and far too sensible to feel anything at all about a man she'd known for 4 days and argued with for 2 minutes. Emma lifted her chin, steadied her hands, and went below to deal with James. She found Rose already handling it. James on the bench, looking 6 inches tall, Rose standing over him with Amelia's own expression of magnificent disappointment delivering the sentence, "Apologize to the captain, to Emma, and to your mother," in that order. Emma leaned in the doorway, watched this girl she'd raised command a room without raising her voice, and felt a pride so fierce it hurt. 4 families on this ship, Sterlings, Searses, O'Connors, Pembrys, all crossing the Atlantic together because William Sears's father was dying in Boston, and when one family grieved, they all went. 22 passengers, 14 of them under 21. One governess who wasn't technically a governess anymore, holding the whole arrangement together through sheer habit and the inability to watch a need go unmet. And a captain with steady hands and hard eyes who just looked at her like she was something he hadn't accounted for in his calculations. Emma pushed that thought down alongside all the others she didn't have time to examine. There was dinner to organize, Charlotte to check on, the matter of whether Bridie O'Connor had actually called Uncle Marcus a Sassenach at luncheon. There was always something to manage, always someone who needed her. She'd built her entire life on that, and she was not going to think about what happened when it stopped being true. Not today. Not on this crossing. Not while that man was watching her from the quarterdeck with an expression she couldn't afford to understand. Chapter 2. Jonah Hale had eaten dinner with aristocrats 237 times, and it never got easier. Tonight should have been worse than most. 2 lords, an American shipping magnate, an Irishman who'd married into the aristocracy, and their wives, all of them warmer and more direct than any passengers he'd carried before. They asked real questions. They used his name. Lord Clarendon wanted to understand the engines. The Marquess of Pembrey, gray-faced from seasickness but refusing to miss dinner, addressed him as Hale rather than Captain, as though they were equals, which they emphatically were not. The Irishman, Daniel O'Connor, caught Jonah's eye across the table and held it a beat too long. "I know," that look said. "I've sat in that chair." William Sears sat at the far end, eating nothing, saying less. Charlotte's hand covered his on the table. "Captain Hale." O'Connor's voice cut through a lull. "What's your honest estimate for the crossing?" William won't ask because he's afraid of the answer. Every head turned. Jonah met O'Connor's gaze directly. The man had given him an opening, a chance to address William's grief without forcing William to voice it. 15 days in fair weather, Mr. O'Connor. 18 if the wind turns. He looked at William. "I intend to give Mr. Sears fair weather." William's throat moved, but no words came. Charlotte's fingers tightened around his. "And if the wind doesn't cooperate?" Miss Lane's voice came from the middle of the table, where she sat in the gap between the families and the young people. "What then?" Jonah looked at her. She'd been quiet all evening, managing things, the way she always seemed to be managing things, diffusing Bridie O'Connor's attempt to interrogate Lord Pembrey about Irish tenant rights, sliding bread to a green-looking Bella Pembrey without anyone else noticing. He'd been tracking her, he realized, for 4 days, and the rigging incident had made it impossible to stop. "Then the engines compensate, Miss Lane. For how long?" "As long as necessary." She tilted her head. The candlelight caught the angle of her jaw, the sharp line of her cheekbone. "That's a very reassuring answer, Captain. Is it also an honest one?" The table went still. Not hostile, curious. Nobody talked to the captain like that. Nobody questioned the reassuring answer and asked for the real one. Except, apparently, Miss Lane, who was looking at him with those steady brown eyes, as though she could see straight through the professional polish to the calculation underneath. Jonah could have deflected, could have smiled and repeated the company line. "The Heiress is built for Atlantic crossings. Nothing to worry about." It was what passengers wanted to hear. "Coal is finite," he heard himself say it. "The engines burn roughly 8 tons per day at half pressure, more in heavy weather. We carry enough for 22 days, which gives us a margin. But the margin narrows if the Atlantic decides to be difficult, and the Atlantic is always difficult. The honest answer is that I will get Mr. Sears to Boston as fast as this ship allows, and I will burn every ton of coal in the hold to do it if I have to. But the ocean doesn't answer to schedules, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you something." Silence. Then Daniel O'Connor laughed, a short, appreciative bark. "There, that's the answer I wanted." William Sears looked up, looked at Jonah directly for the first time all evening, and nodded once with something that might have been relief. The truth, even when it was hard, was better than the polish. Miss Lane's expression hadn't changed, but something behind her eyes had shifted, the same recalibration he'd seen on the quarterdeck that afternoon when she'd corrected him, and he'd had to rethink everything he'd assumed about her. She'd done it again, made him say more than he'd planned, made him be more than the captain. He didn't like how easy she made it. He found her at the port rail an hour after dinner, her face turned up toward the stars. He should have kept walking. The apology he owed her could wait until morning, when the daylight and the crew and the professional distance of the quarterdeck would keep it from becoming anything more than professional. But she was standing in the dark with the wind pulling at her shawl, and she looked like a woman who'd stopped performing for the first time all day, and something about that stillness pulled him off course. "You handled the rigging business well today." She turned. Starlight on the planes of her face, and something tightened in his chest that he hadn't given permission to tighten. "I believe you told me the opposite this afternoon, Captain. I was wrong this afternoon." She considered that, not rushing to accept it, not deflecting with politeness, actually weighing the words. "You were." A pause. "But you came up the mast after him, so I'll forgive the shouting. That's generous of you." "It isn't, actually. I'm keeping a tally." He almost smiled. "Almost. James will apologize tomorrow." He will, or Rose will make his life unbearable. Either way, the outcome is the same. She turned back to the water. You were honest at dinner. About the coal. Most captains wouldn't have been. Most captains don't get ambushed by their passengers. I didn't ambush you. I asked a question. You asked it in front of a man whose father is dying and who needed to hear the truth rather than the comfortable version. That's not a question, Miss Lane. That's a strategy. Her mouth curved, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. Perhaps. Where did you learn to do that? Read a room and take it apart? Books. He looked at her. She looked back, perfectly composed, entirely serious. Books. You sound skeptical, Captain. Books taught me to manage household accounts, speak 3 languages, and navigate the politics of 4 intermarried aristocratic families without anyone losing an eye. They also taught me the names of every star you're looking at. She gestured upward. Polaris, Vega, Arcturus, Deneb, the summer triangle, which isn't actually a constellation, but an asterism composed of stars from 3 separate constellations. Shall I continue? You learned the names? He leaned against the rail, facing her now. Can you navigate by them? Can you read Virgil in the original Latin? That's not the same, isn't it? She turned toward him fully. The wind caught her hair. A strand had worked loose from that severe arrangement, and it whipped across her face. She didn't push it back. You're telling me that your way of knowing the stars is real and mine is theoretical. But I could teach you every myth, every mathematical relationship, every Arabic root of every name in that sky. You could teach me how to find Liverpool. We'd both be right and we'd both be insufficient. Jonah stared at her. In 6 years of command, passengers had flattered him, ignored him, condescended to him, and occasionally feared him. No one had ever argued epistemology with him at a ship's rail at 11 o'clock at night. You've thought about this. I've had time. One learns a great many things from books when one doesn't have the luxury of learning them at sea. Something shifted in her voice. Still sharp, still precise, but with an edge underneath that wasn't intellectual. I didn't choose my education, Captain. I took what was available. The Sterling Library happened to be extraordinary, and I happened to be hungry. Don't mistake where I learned something for how well I know it. The words landed harder than she'd probably intended, or perhaps exactly as hard as she'd intended. He was beginning to suspect that Miss Lane didn't say anything by accident. I wasn't dismissing your education. You were, gently, the way people always do. You learned it from a book, not from experience, so it doesn't quite count. I've heard it my entire life, from tutors, from society, from well-meaning people who assumed that because I'd never left England, I couldn't possibly understand the world. She caught herself, drew a breath. When she spoke again, her voice was level. I'm standing on your ocean right now, Captain. I'd say that counts for something. He should have retreated, should have offered a polite good evening and walked back to his quarterdeck, where the wheel and the compass and the certainty of charted courses would put everything back in its proper place. Instead, he said, You're right. Her eyebrows lifted. Twice in one evening. That must be a record. Don't push your luck, Miss Lane. She laughed. The sound startled them both. Brief, unguarded, entirely real. Not the careful laugh of a woman performing. Something that had escaped before she could catch it. He felt it in his chest, low and warm and deeply inconvenient. The book won't teach you one thing, though. He kept his voice even. How they move. The stars. They look fixed, but they're not. They track across the sky, and the angles change with latitude and season. You need the horizon and the instrument. No book gives you that. Then perhaps someone should teach me. The words hung between them. The wind shifted. The ship rolled gently beneath their feet, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Perhaps. He pushed off the rail, stood straight. Good evening, Miss Lane. Good evening, Captain. He walked away, made it 10 paces before he realized the back of his neck was warm and his pulse was doing something it had no business doing. Miss Lane was a passenger. She was part of the most powerful family network in Anglo-American society. She existed in a world adjacent to his but fundamentally separate, and nothing about an argument under the stars changed that. But no one had argued with him like that in years. No one had pushed back and been right and laughed when he admitted it. No one had stood on his ocean and claimed it. He checked the compass. adjusted the heading by half a degree, and knew, the way he knew a shift in the wind before the sails caught it, that his course had just changed in a direction no instrument could measure. Chapter 3. The Storm Inside. The wave hit the Heiress broadside at 2:30 in the morning, and Emma woke on the floor of her cabin with salt water pooling around her knees. She was moving before she understood what had happened, hands finding the doorframe in the dark, feet bracing against the pitch of the deck. The ship groaned, deep and structural, the timbers complaining against a force they hadn't been built to forgive. Water was coming from somewhere below, a rushing sound beneath the roar of wind and the hammering of rain on the deck above. The corridor was chaos. Charlotte stumbled out of her cabin in a nightgown, William behind her already pulling on his coat. Amelia appeared with a lantern, Nathaniel steadying her against the roll. "Everyone up." Emma's voice cut through the noise. Not loud, but certain. "The saloon, now. Bring blankets, nothing else." William looked at her. He'd built ships. He knew what water in the passenger corridor meant. "How bad?" "I don't know, but we're not staying here to find out." Her hands were shaking. She locked them into fists at her sides and kept moving, because if she stopped moving, she would think about the water, and if she thought about the water, she would think about dying, and Emma Lane did not have time to die tonight. She went door to door. Kate was already dressed, somehow, impossibly, fully dressed at 2 in the morning, clutching her notebook in one hand and Bridie's arm in the other. Bridie was barefoot and swearing in Irish. Sean had his father's medical bag, though nobody had asked him to bring it. Alex was carrying Maggie. James was nowhere. "Where is James?" Kate's face told her before the words did. "He went up when the wave hit." Emma's stomach dropped the same way it had at the base of the mainmast. She turned to Rose. "Get everyone to the saloon." Rose was already moving. "Go." Emma climbed the companionway into a wall of wind and rain. The deck was awash, not spray but solid water, knee-deep in places, surging across the planking with each roll. She couldn't see. The lanterns were out, the stars buried, the whole world reduced to the howl of wind and the taste of salt. "James!" The wind swallowed his name. A hand closed around her arm, hard, bruising, and yanked her sideways against the deckhouse. Captain Hale soaked through, his face inches from hers. The rain had plastered his shirt to his chest and his hair to his forehead, and for one disorienting second, all she could register was the heat of him, how impossibly warm he was against the cold, how solid, how close. His hand on her arm, his breath on her face, the Atlantic trying to wash them both off the deck and his body between her and the water like it was nothing. "What the hell are you doing up here?" James came up when the wave hit. "Where is he?" Something changed behind his eyes, the fury banking into the same cold calculation she'd watched him make at the base of the mainmast. "Foremast rigging, starboard side. He's helping my crew secure a torn sail. My bosun has him." The relief nearly took her legs. She sagged against the deckhouse, and his grip shifted, from restraint to support, his hand moving to her shoulder, steadying her. "There's water in the passenger corridor." She forced the words out over the wind. "I've moved everyone to the saloon. It's coming in fast, port side, below the waterline." He was already mapping it. She could see his eyes move, tracing the ship's anatomy in his head. The hull seam. The engines are shaking it loose. He released her shoulder. "I need you below. My crew's on deck. I can't spare men for passengers." "I've been managing your passengers since Liverpool, Captain. I don't need to be asked." That almost smile again, even now, even soaked and shouting over a gale. "Keep the corridor door shut. Don't let anyone go back for belongings." He turned toward the quarterdeck, then stopped, turned back. Emma. Her name. Not Miss Lane. Ripped out of him by the wind, or by something the wind had nothing to do with. It went through her like a current, warm and dangerous and entirely wrong for a storm in the middle of the Atlantic, and she filed it in the same locked place where she'd put the flicker at the rail and the way his eyes had followed her at dinner, and she shut the door on it hard. "Don't come back up here." She went below. Rose had the saloon organized, blankets distributed, families grouped, lanterns clustered where they'd give light without risking fire. Emma took it in with a single glance and felt pride hit her so hard it nearly winded her. James is on deck. He's safe, safe. The captain has him. She said it to the room, but she was looking at Charlotte, whose face had gone the color of old paper. Charlotte closed her eyes. William's arm tightened around her. The captain says we stay here. The lower cabins are flooding, but the saloon is above the waterline. We keep the corridor door shut. She looked at the room. 22 people, most of them among the wealthiest families in the Atlantic world, huddled in blankets and nightgowns. We wait. Marcus Pembry was in an armchair, gray as death, Lucy's hand on his back. Perfectly well, he announced to nobody. Merely resting my eyes. Of course you are, Uncle Marcus. Emma tucked a blanket around his knees. Rest them shut, if you can. She couldn't stop moving, not because they needed her every second. Rose had the younger ones in hand. Amelia was calm. Daniel had positioned himself near the door like a man who fully intended to punch the ocean if it tried anything. But because standing still meant listening to the ship groan and not knowing whether the next sound would be the hull giving way. She spoke Irish to Bridie until Bridie's fists unclenched. She sat with Bella, who was shaking, and talked her through slow breaths. She listened to Kate recite the ship's statistics under her breath. Displacement tonnage, engine horsepower, hull thickness, and didn't tell her to stop because Kate needed the numbers the way Emma needed the motion. Once, just once, the ship rolled hard enough to send a lantern sliding off its hook, and every person in the room went silent. In that silence, Emma heard the water below them, moving in the dark like something alive, and she thought, we could die here, all of us. I could die on this ship in the middle of nowhere, and I have never once in my life done a single thing just because I wanted to. The thought was so clear and so terrible that it stopped her breath. Then the ship righted. The lantern was caught, Bridie swore, and Emma kept moving, because that was what she did. She kept moving. An hour in, maybe 2, the saloon door opened. Jonah came down the companionway drenched, coatless, his shirt plastered to his chest, his hair streaming water onto the floor. There was a gash across his left palm that was bleeding freely, and he didn't seem to have noticed it. Something in Emma's chest unlocked at the sight of him. A knot she hadn't known she'd been holding. He was alive. He was whole. The relief was so sharp and so disproportionate to anything she had a right to feel about this man that she had to press her hand flat against her sternum to keep it from showing on her face. The breach is sealed. His voice carried the same calm authority Emma recognized from her own. The voice you built when falling apart wasn't an option. My engineer has shored the hull seam. The pumps are handling the water. We'll be through the worst within the hour. Silence. Then William stood, crossed the saloon, and held out his hand. Jonah looked at it, then at William's face. He shook the hand. Charlotte mouthed thank you from behind her husband's shoulder. Daniel lifted a hand in quiet salute. Jonah's eyes found Emma across the room. A look, brief, private, in a space full of people too exhausted to notice. She held it for a second longer than was wise. Then she looked at his hand. You're bleeding. He looked down, caught it on a fitting. Sit down. Miss Lane, I wasn't asking. She was already pulling clean linen from the supply she'd organized when they'd first moved into the saloon. Sean, bring your father's bag. He sat on a crate and let her work. Sean appeared with the medical kit, already holding the bandage roll. Emma cleaned the gash, deep, jagged, full of salt, and Jonah's jaw tightened, but he didn't make a sound. His hand was warm beneath hers. Calloused, scarred across the knuckles, rope burned at the base of each finger. She could feel his pulse against her fingertips. Too fast, though his face gave nothing away. You should have had this seen to immediately. I was busy saving the ship. You're bleeding all over the saloon. The saloon will survive. She tied off the bandage, looked up. His face was inches from hers, closer than the deck house, closer than the rail, close enough to see the exhaustion behind his eyes and the effort it cost him to keep it hidden. Close enough to see the small scar at the edge of his jaw. Close enough that if she leaned forward, just barely, just the smallest fraction, she would know what the rain tasted like on his skin. The thought arrived without permission, vivid and reckless, and she felt the heat rise up her throat. You moved 22 people out of flooding cabins in the dark, he said quietly, in under 10 minutes. Don't thank me, Miss Lane. I wasn't going to. She let go of his hand. I was going to tell you your bandage needs changing in 4 hours, and if you don't come find me, I'll come find you. Something moved in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or the recognition that no one had given him an order in a very long time. Yes, ma'am. The way he said it. Low, rough, with the corner of his mouth barely lifting, not mocking, not deferential, but something in between that made her stomach flip in a way that had absolutely nothing to do with the ship's role. She turned away before he could see what it did to her. Amelia appeared at her elbow with a cup of broth. Drink. I'm fine, Amelia. Emma Lane, you haven't eaten since yesterday, and you are going to drink this broth, or I am going to pour it down your throat. And I have been wanting to say that to you for approximately 15 years. Amelia pressed the cup into her hands. Drink. Emma drank. Lukewarm, oversalted, the best thing she'd ever tasted. The storm passed by dawn. The sky cleared from the west, and by mid-morning the sea had settled into long, rolling swells, exhausted like everyone aboard. The day passed in the quiet mechanics of recovery. Wet cabins aired, soaked belongings hung to dry, meals eaten in grateful silence. By evening, the ship felt almost normal. Almost. Emma went above deck at midnight because the ship was full of people breathing the slow rhythms of sleep, and she needed air that didn't taste of damp wool and fear. The deck was washed clean. The stars were out. All of them. More than she'd ever seen, as though the storm had scrubbed the sky down to its bones. She gripped the port rail and let the cold fill her lungs. She should have felt triumphant. She'd done everything right. Moved people, kept calm, managed a crisis in the dark. She'd been competent and necessary, and exactly what everyone needed her to be. And now the crisis was over, and the children were sleeping, and Rose had handled half of it without being asked, and tomorrow everything would go back to the way it was. Emma managing, Emma circulating, Emma filling the gaps between other people's lives, because she'd never figured out how to build one of her own. The tears came without permission. She pressed her face into her hands and wept, not from exhaustion, but from the understanding that she was 29 years old and the only thing she'd ever built was a life made entirely of other people's needs. She didn't hear him approach. Couldn't sleep either. His voice came from behind her, quiet and rough with fatigue. She wiped her face. The gesture was graceless, nothing like composed Miss Lane. I'm quite well, Captain. No, you're not. He moved to the rail beside her. Not close enough to touch, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through the cold, salt air. But you will be. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't offer comfort or solutions or any of the well-meaning platitudes people offered when they wanted the crying to stop. He stood beside her at the rail and let her be exactly as wrecked as she was. The clouds parted. Stars appeared, Polaris first, steady in the north, then the others filling in around it. The ones she'd learned from a book, the ones he'd learned from the sea. Her breathing slowed, the tears dried on her cheeks in the wind. Her hands stopped shaking. At some point, his shoulder had come to rest against hers. She couldn't have said when, whether he'd moved or she had, or the ship had simply rolled them together. The contact was slight, the weight of a coat sleeve against a shawl. Nothing, really. The most intimate moment of her life. She stayed until the sky was full of stars she almost knew the names of. Then she said good night without looking at him, because looking would have undone the last of her, and went below to her cabin and lay in the dark with her hand pressed to her shoulder, where his warmth still lingered. She could still feel it, the weight of him against her. Not a touch, not an embrace, just the simple pressure of one body beside another in the dark. She had been held before. Amelia had held her as a child, and Rose had hugged her just this morning, and none of it, had felt like this. Like being found, like being known by someone who hadn't asked a single question and somehow understood every answer. Emma pressed her face into the pillow and thought, I am in so much trouble. Chapter 4. Jonah Hale had not slept. This was not unusual. After a storm, he often stayed on deck through the night, checking the rigging, monitoring the hull repair, letting his hands do the work while his mind cataloged damage. The Heiress had weathered worse. The cracked seam was shored, the pumps had cleared the water, The carpenter was already replacing planking below the waterline. He'd written his report for William, inspected every inch of the hull he could reach, and spoken to every member of his crew. None of that explained why he was still standing at the quarterdeck rail at 7:30 in the evening, watching the companionway hatch as though something might emerge from it that would rearrange the known world. His hand throbbed. The gash across his palm had been properly cleaned and bandaged by her, with her fingers against his skin and her face inches from his and the taste of rain still in the air between them. She'd told him the bandage needed changing in 4 hours. That had been 16 hours ago. He should find the ship's surgeon. He should change it himself. He should do anything other than stand here like a man waiting to be found by a woman he had absolutely no business wanting to find him. The hatch opened. Emma Lane climbed onto the deck with a strip of clean linen in one hand and a cup of tea in the other. "You didn't come find me." She crossed the quarterdeck as though she owned it. "I told you what would happen. I've been busy. You've been standing at this rail for 20 minutes. I can see the quarterdeck from the saloon windows." She set the tea on the binnacle and held out her hand. "Let me see." He gave her his hand. He could have argued. He could have told her he'd handle it himself, that the captain of a ship didn't submit to medical inspection from a governess on his own quarterdeck. But she was standing in front of him with the last of the daylight catching the loose strands of hair at her temples, and the truth was that he'd been waiting for her to come, and they both knew it. She unwound the old bandage. Her fingers were cool and precise, and she worked without looking up, which meant he could look down at her. The line of her jaw, the crease between her brows as she examined the wound, the way she held his hand with both of hers, as though it were something worth being careful with. "It's clean. No infection." She began wrapping the new linen. "You were lucky. I'm always lucky. You were standing on a flooded deck in a gale with no coat, securing a hull breach with your bare hands. That's not luck, Captain. That's a staggering lack of self-preservation," said the woman who climbed onto that same deck in her nightgown looking for James. Her hands paused on the bandage. She looked up. "I had a shawl." "Oh well, a shawl, that changes everything." She laughed, that same unguarded sound from the deck 2 nights ago, the one that had lodged somewhere beneath his sternum and refused to leave. She tied off the bandage and released his hand, but she didn't step back. She stayed where she was, close enough that he could smell the salt air in her hair and something underneath it. Soap or tea or whatever scent belonged to Emma Lane when the sea hadn't washed everything else away. "Your tea is getting cold." She nodded toward the binnacle. He picked it up, drank. It was perfect, strong, no sugar, the way the crew made it. "How did you know how I take my tea?" "I asked your steward." She said it the way she said everything. Factual, unembarrassed, as though learning a man's preferences was simply the practical thing to do rather than an act of attention so precise it made his chest ache. "I ask everyone. It's a habit. A governess's habit. A human habit. You'd be surprised how much people tell you when you remember how they take their tea." The helmsman was pretending to study the compass with an intensity that suggested he was listening to every word. Jonah didn't care. The sky was turning violet at the western edge, and Emma Lane was standing on his quarterdeck with the wind in her hair, and he wanted to know everything about her and had no right to any of it. "Stay." The word came out before he could stop it. "The sky's clear. You said you wanted to learn how the stars move." She held his gaze. Something flickered in her expression. Caution, awareness, the same calculation he'd watched her make at the rail. She was deciding whether this was wise. "I believe your exact words were perhaps someone should teach me, and I believe yours were perhaps. That was 2 days ago. I've had time to consider. And I'm still here, Captain." He retrieved the sextant from the navigation cabinet. Brass, heavy, the most precise instrument aboard the ship. He positioned her at the rail where the horizon was cleanest, the last glow of sunset fading into a sky that was filling with stars from the east. "Find Polaris. The book taught you where it is. The sextant will teach you what it means." She raised the instrument, struggled with the weight. Her arms weren't built for it. The sextant was designed for sailors' hands, men who hauled rope and climbed rigging. She adjusted, compensated, held it steady through sheer stubbornness. Bring the star down to the horizon line. He was standing behind her, too close. He could feel the warmth of her through the evening air, and his hand was moving before his brain could intervene. Reaching around her to steady the instrument, his fingers closing over hers on the brass frame. She went still, not rigid, still, the way the sea went, still before the wind shifted. He could feel her breathing change against his chest. His voice had dropped to something barely above a murmur. When the star touches the horizon, read the angle. I'm trying. Her voice wasn't steady either. You're rather distracting, Captain. He let go, stepped back. The evening air rushed into the space between them, and he felt the loss of her warmth like a physical thing. She took the reading, lowered the sextant. 51 degrees, 14 minutes. 51 degrees, 9 minutes. You're off by 5. 5 minutes. 5 minutes is the difference between Boston Harbor and a sandbar off Cape Cod. Try again. She tried again. 51 degrees, 10 minutes. 1 off. Remarkable. Better. He was impressed and had no intention of showing it. You'll have us in Boston Harbor by the end of the week. I learned from a book. She lowered the instrument and looked at him. And from the sea, it appears both methods have their uses. He could have smiled. He could have let the evening settle into something polished and safe. Instead, he said, "Where did you come from, Emma?" Her first name again. This time he'd meant it. She didn't flinch, didn't retreat behind Miss Lane. She set the sextant on the rail between them and looked at the water. St. Margaret's, in London. The building was condemned. The east wall collapsed in a storm. Amelia and Nathaniel came to inspect the damage. I was 8, sleeping 3 to a bed in the rooms that were left. A pause. They took me home, educated me, loved me in their way. I've been part of their household ever since. That's a long time to live in someone else's house. The words came out harder than he'd intended. He watched them hit, the small tightening around her mouth, the flash of something in her eyes that wasn't anger but was close to it. Yes, quiet, controlled. It is. I'm not. He stopped, started again. I'm not judging. I understand living in borrowed spaces. Then tell me. Liverpool docks. My father loaded cargo for other men's ships, Sears ships as it happened, before William moved the company offices to London. The Atlantic trade still runs through Liverpool. Always has. A crate slipped its chain when I was 11. I went to sea at 12 because there was nothing on land worth staying for. She didn't offer sympathy, didn't soften her expression into pity. She looked at him the way she'd looked at the sextant, steadily, with her full attention, measuring something he couldn't see. We're both self-made then. We're both stubborn enough to survive being self-made. There's a difference. Is there? Surviving something isn't the same as choosing it. You didn't choose the orphanage. I didn't choose the docks. We chose what came after. Her eyes were bright, not tears, something fiercer. I'm not sure I chose anything. I think I just stayed, because staying was easier than asking for something different, because being needed felt close enough to being wanted that I could pretend they were the same thing. The honesty of it winded him. She'd said it without flinching, without the careful packaging she put around everything else, and it was the bravest thing he'd heard on this ship. Braver than the storm, braver than the deck in the dark. They're not the same thing. He picked up the sextant, held it out to her. Try once more. She took it. Their fingers brushed on the brass, and this time neither of them pretended it was accidental. She raised the instrument, read the angle. 51 degrees, 9 minutes. Perfect. There. His voice had gone rough. Now you can find Boston. She lowered the sextant and smiled at him. Not the polished version, not the governess. Something unguarded and slightly crooked, and entirely her own, and it hit him the way a rogue wave hits. No warning, no time to brace, just the sudden understanding that the world had shifted and nothing was where he'd left it. Same time tomorrow? The edge was gone from her voice. What was left was almost gentle. Same time tomorrow. She handed back the sextant, and her fingers lingered on his. 1 second, 2, before she turned and walked across the quarterdeck and disappeared down the companionway. Jonah set the sextant in its case, checked the compass, checked the stars, did all the things a captain did when the watch was quiet and the sky was clear and the ship ran true. None of it settled him. He could still feel her fingers on the brass where his had been, could still hear her voice. Being needed felt close enough to being wanted that I could pretend they were the same thing, and the terrible recognition that she just described him perfectly. The sea, the command, the ship beneath his feet. He'd told himself for years that this was enough. Emma Lane had just made a liar of him. Chapter 5. Emma Lane was folding towels in the narrow passage between the linen store and the galley when Rose appeared at her elbow, flushed and bright-eyed and practically vibrating. "Have you kissed him?" Emma dropped a towel. "I beg your pardon?" "The captain. Have you kissed him yet?" Rose grabbed both of Emma's hands, bouncing on her toes. "Kate told me about the quarterdeck. Every evening after we retire. Emma, he's teaching you the stars. He's teaching me celestial navigation. It's educational. It's the most romantic thing I've ever heard, and I've read every novel in Mama's library." Rose pressed her back against the corridor wall and clasped her hands together. "Tell me everything. Does he stand very close? Does he look at you the way he looked at you at dinner? You know, when you asked about the coal and he told you the truth instead of the polished answer?" "Because I nearly died, Emma. I nearly died. You're being ridiculous. I'm being observant. There's a difference." Rose leaned closer. "He watches you, all the time, when you're sorting out the galley or calming Maggie down or just walking across the deck. He watches you like you're the only interesting thing on this entire ship, and Emma, the man has an ocean to look at." Emma retrieved the dropped towel. Her face was hot. "Rose Sterling, I am not discussing this with you." "Why not? Who else are you going to discuss it with?" Amelia would worry. Charlotte would strategize. Bridie would say something appalling in 2 languages. Rose's eyes softened, still bright, still delighted, but with something gentler underneath. "I've never seen you like this. You get this look when he's nearby, like you're trying very hard not to smile and failing completely. It's wonderful. It's inappropriate. It's wonderful," Rose repeated firmly. "He's handsome and he's brave and he drinks his tea like it's the last cup on earth. And when you argue with him, he gets this expression like he can't decide whether to kiss you or surrender." She tilted her head. "So, have you kissed him?" "No." "Why on earth not?" Emma opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Because I am 29 years old, and he is the captain of this ship, and it would be entirely— If you say inappropriate one more time, I shall scream." Rose took both of Emma's hands. Her grip was warm and sure. "Emma, you've spent your whole life taking care of everyone else, every single one of us. When do you get to have something that's just yours?" The question slipped past every defense Emma had. Too simple, too kind, too much like something she'd been afraid to ask herself. Emma's throat tightened. "I don't know how." "Well," Rose squeezed her hands and smiled. "I'd start by kissing him." She disappeared down the corridor, practically skipping, and Emma stood where she was holding clean towels and feeling as though the deck had shifted beneath her feet. When do you get to have something that's just yours? The question followed Emma down the corridor and into the quiet of her own thoughts, and once it was there, it unlocked everything she'd been refusing to look at. The way she'd started listening for his footsteps on the quarterdeck above her cabin. The way her pulse kicked every time he said her name. The specific, detailed, entirely inappropriate memory of his hands over hers on the sextant that she replayed every night in her bunk like a woman who'd lost her mind. She wanted him. The admission, even silent, even private, even here in a corridor that smelled of linen and salt, made her face burn. She wanted Jonah Hale, his rough voice and his steady hands, and the way he looked at her as though she were something worth navigating toward. She wanted to stand on his quarterdeck and argue with him about books and stars until one of them closed the distance. She wanted to know what happened after. Emma Lane, who had never in 29 years wanted a single thing she hadn't earned the right to want, was burning alive from the inside. That evening, Charlotte arranged a portable pianoforte on the main deck between the deck house and the mainmast. Lanterns swung from the rigging. The sea was calm, the sky enormous, and for the first time since Liverpool, the entire company was assembled without a crisis to manage. Charlotte played something tender and slightly melancholic. Maggie sang. James borrowed a sailor's fiddle and played badly enough that Kate wrote what was almost certainly a review. The parents danced, Marcus pulling Lucy into a swaying waltz, Nathaniel drawing Amelia close with a hand at the small of her back, moving together the way people moved who had memorized each other's bodies. Daniel and Caroline stood at the rail, his arm around her waist, her head against his shoulder. Not dancing, just standing together. Emma felt the wanting like a fist behind her ribs. This was what she didn't have. Not the music, the standing together, the having someone who was yours, who chose you every morning and whose arm around your waist meant I'm here. I chose this, and I'd choose it again. She was standing alone at the edge of the light, and Rose's voice was still in her head. When do you get to have something that's just yours? And the answer was now, apparently. Now, on this ship, in the middle of the ocean, wanting something she had no idea how to reach for. From the quarterdeck, she felt his eyes. She didn't look. If she looked, everyone would see. Rose would know, and Kate would record it, and Maggie would sketch it, and the whole careful, invisible architecture of Miss Lane would crack along the fault line she'd been pretending wasn't there. She looked. Captain Hale stood at the helm, one hand on the wheel, backlit by the binnacle lamp. He wasn't watching the music or the dancing or the families. He was watching her. And his face, usually so carefully controlled, held an expression she recognized because she was wearing it herself. I don't know how, I'm terrified. The music played, the lantern swung. Emma held his gaze for 3 seconds that lasted the rest of her life, and then she looked away and pressed her hand flat against her stomach, as if she could push the wanting back inside, where it was safe. William broke the spell, though not the way she'd expected. He'd been better tonight. He'd been the one to suggest Charlotte play, had smiled when James murdered the fiddle, had even laughed at something Marcus said. For an hour, he'd looked like himself again, and Emma had almost let herself believe the worst had passed. But she saw the moment it caught him, a pause between songs where the laughter died and the ocean filled the silence, and his face changed. Not into the rigid mask he'd worn all crossing, but into something worse, the raw understanding that he'd forgotten, for 1 hour, that his father was dying. He stood, crossed the deck toward the quarterdeck, not rigid, not urgent, but decided. Charlotte's hands stilled on the keys. She didn't follow. She knew him well enough to let him go. Emma couldn't hear the conversation, but she saw Jonah listen, nod, and reach for the engine telegraph. The deck vibrated differently, a deeper hum, a harder pulse through the planking. The Heiress surged forward, and Emma felt the change in her feet before she understood it. Full pressure, every ton of coal Jonah had held in reserve, burning now. William came back down the steps. He sat beside Charlotte on the bench and said something too low to carry. She nodded, closed the pianoforte lid, and took his hand. They sat like that, still together, the music over, and nobody asked why. Their navigation lesson that night was different. Emma felt it the moment she stepped onto the quarterdeck. Jonah was standing at the rail with his hands braced wide and his shoulders tight, and he didn't turn when she approached. The engines were louder now, a constant driving rhythm that vibrated through the deck and up through her bones. The ship was running hard. William asked you to push. His father is dying. Every hour matters. He still hadn't turned. I should have done it days ago. You were managing the coal. I was being cautious. Caution is a luxury William can't afford. He turned then, and she could see the cost of the decision in his face, the tightness around his eyes, the set of his mouth. We'll make Boston in 11 days at this rate. Maybe 10. 10 days. She'd been counting them as time gained. Now she counted them as time left. Show me something new. She held out her hand for the sextant. I've mastered Polaris. What else can you teach me? Something shifted in his face, the tension cracking, just barely, at the edges. He retrieved the sextant and positioned her at the rail. Arcturus, brighter than Polaris, harder to read. You have to account for its declination. It sits at a different angle to the horizon depending on the season. She raised the instrument, found the star. The brass was cold in her hands and the weight pulled at her shoulders. And then he was behind her again, closer than the last lesson, close enough that his chest nearly touched her back. His hands came around to steady her grip, and the heat of him flooded down her spine like a lit fuse. Steady. His voice was at her ear. Low. Rough. Bring it down slowly. She couldn't breathe. Every nerve in her body was focused on the line where his chest almost met her back, the warmth of his breath against her neck, the way his fingers overlapped hers on the brass frame. She could feel his heartbeat, or was that hers? The boundary had blurred. I'm trying to concentrate. Her voice came out thinner than she'd intended. You're making it difficult. Am I? Not a question. His thumb moved, barely, the smallest shift, across the back of her hand, and the sensation traveled up her arm and detonated somewhere behind her sternum. She lowered the sextant, turned inside the circle of his arms. His hands were still raised where the instrument had been, which meant she was standing in the space between them, inches from his chest, looking up at his face in the starlight. Neither of them moved. The wind pulled at her hair. His jaw was tight and his eyes were dark, and she could see his pulse at his throat, fast, faster than a captain's pulse had any right to be. Emma, her name in his mouth like something he'd been holding back for days. I know, she did. She knew exactly what was happening, exactly what would happen if one of them closed the distance, and she wanted it. Wanted it with a ferocity that burned through every carefully constructed layer of composure and duty and gratitude until there was nothing left but a woman standing in front of a man, wanting. His hand came up, touched her face. The pad of his thumb traced her cheekbone, rough, calloused, impossibly gentle, and her eyes fell shut. The world narrowed to the pressure of his hand and the warmth of his breath and the space between them that was closing, almost gone. He stopped. His hand dropped from her face. He stepped back. The night air rushed into the space where his warmth had been, and she felt it like a door closing. Forgive me, 2 words. Rough, scraped thin. He wasn't looking at her. That was, I shouldn't have. He didn't finish. Emma opened her eyes. The quarterdeck was the same. The helm, the binnacle, the stars she'd been learning to read. But everything had shifted, the way a ship shifts when the ballast moves, and suddenly nothing is level anymore. Of course, the thought arrived with the dull familiarity of something she'd always known. Of course, he stopped. What did you think was going to happen? You're the governess. You're the charity case the Sterlings took in. You're the woman who folds towels and manages other people's children, and you just stood on this man's quarterdeck and lifted your face to be kissed like you had any right to. She needed to say something. Something composed, something that would make this easier for both of them. Quite all right, Captain. Think nothing of it. The kind of graceful retreat she'd been performing her entire life, smoothing over awkwardness, making other people comfortable, swallowing whatever she actually felt so deeply it couldn't surface again. She looked at him. He was staring at the horizon. His hands were at his sides, and they weren't steady. His jaw was working, and his breathing was wrong. And he looked. She didn't know what he looked like. She didn't know what any of this meant. She only knew that the composed, appropriate thing to do was to walk away and never come back to this quarterdeck, and that the thought of doing that made her feel like she was dying. I'll be here tomorrow. She didn't know where the words came from. She had no idea what he was feeling. She only knew what she was feeling, which was terrified and humiliated and alive in a way she had never been before. And she was not going to let the shame decide for her. Not this time. Not about this. His head turned. She couldn't read his expression. She didn't try. Same time. She held his gaze even though it cost her everything she had. Then she turned and crossed the quarterdeck before her courage ran out, down the companionway on legs that didn't feel solid, past the saloon, down the corridor. She shut the cabin door, leaned against it. Her hands were shaking and her eyes were burning, and she pressed them both flat against the wood and stood there breathing until the tightness in her chest loosened enough to let her think. She had no idea if he'd be there tomorrow. She had no idea if she'd just humiliated herself completely. She had no idea about anything except that she'd said it, I'll be here tomorrow, and she'd meant it, and she'd wanted something and refused to take it back. The tears came, not the quiet, composed tears she'd wept at the rail, messy, graceless, the kind that made her face hot and her breathing ugly. She pressed her fist to her mouth and let them come because there was no one to perform for, no one to manage, no one who needed her to be steady. Just Emma, terrified, wanting, refusing to retreat. She didn't sleep for a long time, but somewhere in the dark, between the fear and the shame and the relentless replay of his thumb on her cheekbone, something small and stubborn took root. She was going back. Chapter 6. Jonah hadn't slept. He'd stood the midnight watch and the dawn watch after it, letting his first mate sleep, because standing at the helm with the wind in his face and the stars overhead was easier than lying in his cabin replaying the moment his hand dropped from her face. The exact quality of the silence after "Forgive me." The way she'd looked at him, not angry, not composed, something worse than both, and said, "I'll be here tomorrow," in a voice that didn't waver, and then walked away across his quarterdeck while he stood there with his hands shaking and no idea how to call her back. He'd pulled away. He'd had her face tilted up to his in the starlight with her eyes closed and her breath warm against his mouth, and he'd pulled away, and he couldn't even explain why. Not to her, not to himself. Only that the wanting had risen so fast and so large that it had swallowed everything. The ship, the command, the 20 years of carefully constructed identity that began with a dead father on the Liverpool docks and ended with Captain Hale, a man who needed nothing from anyone because the sea was enough. Except it wasn't. She'd made a liar of him 3 nights ago standing at this same rail, and last night she'd stood inside the circle of his arms, and he'd felt what it would be like to have something the ocean couldn't give him. And the enormity of it had sent him stumbling backward like a green sailor in his first gale. Coward. The word sat in his chest like ballast. The day was relentless. Full pressure meant constant vigilance. The engines ran hot, the boilers needed monitoring before, and the chief engineer sent hourly reports on coal consumption and water levels. Jonah threw himself into it, checked the rigging, inspected the hull repairs, reviewed the charts for the northern approach to Boston, and calculated fuel margins so tight they left no room for weather. He worked the way he always worked when something was wrong, thoroughly, methodically, as though precision could substitute for courage. He saw her twice, once at mid-morning, crossing the main deck with a stack of linens, Miss Lane, composed, purposeful, not looking up. Once at the noon meal, seated between Rose and Maggie, laughing at something Kate had said. The laugh traveled across the saloon and lodged in the same place it always did, somewhere beneath his ribs where it had no business being. She didn't look at him. He couldn't stop looking at her. Daniel found him at the port rail in the late afternoon, staring at the horizon as though it held instructions. "You look terrible." "Thank you. I mean it." Daniel leaned against the rail beside him, easy, unforced, the way he did everything. "You look like a man who's been punched and can't figure out by whom." "I'm managing the approach. We're running at full pressure with a 7-day fuel margin and deteriorating weather to the west." "You're standing at a rail staring at nothing." Daniel let the silence sit for a moment. "I've been where you are, Captain. Not on a ship, but in the place where you want something, and you're too bloody proud or too bloody scared to reach for it." Jonah said nothing. "Caroline was the daughter of an English earl. I was an Irish nobody with a dead best friend and a name that made drawing rooms go quiet. Every reasonable voice in my head told me I had no right to her, that I'd ruin her life, that wanting her was selfishness dressed up as love." Daniel turned to face him. "You know what I learned? I'm sure you'll tell me. That every reason I had for walking away was about me, my pride, my fear. Not one of them was about what she actually wanted." He held Jonah's gaze. "Something's happened between you and Emma. I don't know what, and I don't need to. Nothing has happened between me and Miss Lane. Captain?" Daniel's voice was patient in the way that only made it worse. "I've watched men lie for a living. You're not even good at it." Jonah's hands tightened on the rail. "Is it obvious?" "To me, yes. To Rose, probably. To the crew?" Daniel shrugged. "Your sailors are more interested in the coal supply than your love life. But you're standing at a rail looking like death, and she hasn't so much as glanced at the quarterdeck all day. It doesn't take a detective. The thought that others could see, that whatever careful distance he'd maintained had already cracked visibly enough for Daniel Bloody O'Connor to read from across a deck, sent something cold through his chest. Whatever you're telling yourself right now, Daniel continued, make sure it's about her and not about you. Because if it's about you, your station, your pride, what you think you deserve, then you're not protecting her. You're just a coward in a captain's coat. Daniel clapped him once on the shoulder and walked away. Jonah stood at the rail. The sun was dropping toward the western horizon, and the light was turning gold, and Daniel O'Connor was right about everything, and Jonah hated him for it. The hour came. Their hour. The unspoken appointment they'd kept for 4 nights running, when the passengers retired, and the quarterdeck belonged to the stars and the helmsman and whatever they were building between navigation readings. 9 o'clock, the sky clear, Polaris steady, the sextant in its case on the navigation cabinet. She didn't come. 9 o'clock became half past became 9:45. Jonah stood at the rail with the sextant case beside him and told himself it didn't matter, that she'd changed her mind, that the sensible thing, the professional thing, was to put the instrument away and resume being the captain and stop waiting. He reached for the case. Footsteps on the companionway. Emma climbed onto the quarterdeck. She was wearing a shawl over her dress, her hair loose, not the careful arrangement she wore during the day, but down, dark against her shoulders, the way the wind had pulled it during the storm. She stopped at the top of the steps and looked at him across the deck. "You're late." Rose wouldn't stop talking. She crossed the quarterdeck toward him. "She had opinions about my hair." "Your hair is down." "Yes, that was the opinion." She stopped in front of him. "I believe I said same time. I didn't say I'd be punctual." "You're an hour late." 53 minutes. She held out her hand. "I believe we were working on Arcturus." Something loosened in his chest, the knot that had been tightening since 9 o'clock. She was here. She was late, and her hand was trembling, and she was making jokes about her hair, and she was here. He took the sextant from its case, put it in her hands. Their fingers touched on the brass, that same jolt, that same heat, and he watched her breath catch, watched her eyes flicker to his and away, and he thought, she's shaking, and she came anyway. That's the bravest thing anyone has ever done on this ship. She raised the instrument, found Arcturus. Her arms were steadier than last night. She was learning the weight, compensating, holding it through will and practice. Bring it down. He was behind her. Not as close as last night, giving her room, giving them both room, though every nerve in his body was pulling toward her like a compass needle swinging north. "I know how. Quiet, not sharp. Just certain." She brought the star to the horizon and read the angle. 16 degrees, 42 minutes. 16 degrees, 40 minutes. You're off by 2. Close enough to find land. Close enough. His voice had gone rough. "Emma." She lowered the sextant, didn't turn. He could see the line of her neck, the place where her hair fell away from her shoulder, the small movement of her breathing. "You pulled away last night." "I know. You said forgive me, and you couldn't finish the sentence." "I know. I need you to finish it." She turned then. The sextant was still in her hands, between them, brass and weight, and the instrument that had given them every excuse to stand this close. Her eyes were bright and direct and afraid. Not an apology. Not that was inappropriate. "Tell me why." He looked at her. The words were somewhere in his chest, tangled up with salt water and solitude, and the identity he'd built plank by plank from a dead man's docks. "Because I want things I don't know how to have." It came out rough and plain, and entirely without the polish he used on passengers and crew, and every other soul who expected Captain Hale to know his heading. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. "What things?" "You." The word fell between them, like an anchor dropping. She stared at him. He watched her lips part, watched her eyes go bright, watched the composure she wore like armor crack straight down the center. And then she set the sextant on the deck, stepped forward, and put her hands on his chest. He kissed her. Not carefully. Not the way he'd imagined in the sleepless hours, measured, restrained, a gentleman's kiss on a gentleman's quarterdeck. He kissed her the way the sea hit the hull in a storm, all at once, with everything behind it. His hands came up and cradled her face, fingers sliding into her hair, tilting her mouth to his. She tasted like salt air and tea, and something underneath that was entirely her, warm and real and alive against him. Her hands fisted in his shirt, pulling him closer, and a sound came out of her, a small, shattered breath against his mouth that undid every defense he had left. He kissed her deeper. Her lips parted under his, and the world contracted to the heat of her mouth, and the grip of her hands and the press of her body against his chest. One of his hands slid from her face to the back of her neck, fingers tangling in her hair, and she arched into him. A movement so instinctive, so unguarded, that it sent a bolt of heat through his entire body. She kissed him back with the same ferocity she brought to everything, the storms, the arguments, the navigation readings, as though she'd been waiting for exactly this moment to stop being careful. Her hands slid up his chest to his shoulders, pulling him down to her, and he went willingly, bending into her, one arm wrapping around her waist to hold her against him because he absolutely could not, let there be space between them again. The wind moved around them. The ship ran on beneath their feet. Somewhere the helmsman was looking very carefully at his compass. Jonah pulled back, not away, not far, just enough to breathe. His forehead rested against hers. Her hands were still on his shoulders. His arm was still around her waist. They were breathing the same air, ragged and warm, and her eyes were closed and her lips were swollen, and he had never in his life seen anything as beautiful as Emma Lane in the starlight with her composure finally, completely gone. That, her voice was wrecked, was worth waiting for. He laughed. It surprised him, a real laugh, rough and low, pulled from somewhere he'd forgotten existed. Her eyes opened, and she smiled at him, that crooked, unguarded smile, and he kissed her again because he couldn't help it, shorter this time, softer, his mouth brushing hers as though confirming she was real. I don't know how this works. His lips moved against hers. I live on this ship. You live in their world. I don't have a house or a... She put her finger on his mouth. Not tonight. Emma? Tonight I just want this. Her hand moved from his lips to his jaw, her thumb tracing the scar she'd noticed 100 times and never touched. Tomorrow we figure out the rest. Tonight we're just two people on a quarterdeck and you just kissed me, and I'd very much like you to do it again. He did it again. And again. And somewhere between the third kiss and the fourth, the urgency softened into something slower, deeper, his mouth learning the shape of hers, her fingers learning the angles of his face, both of them mapping new territory with the patience and precision of navigators who just discovered land. When they finally pulled apart, the stars had shifted overhead, the watch had changed, and the helmsman had been replaced by a second mate who was studying the compass with desperate concentration. Emma stepped back. Her hair was a disaster. Her shawl had fallen to the deck at some point, and neither of them had noticed. She looked at him with bright eyes and swollen lips and an expression that was half wonder, half terror. Same time tomorrow? Every night until Boston. His voice was rough and certain and entirely his own. She picked up her shawl, collected the sextant and placed it in its case with hands that weren't quite steady. At the top of the companionway she turned back. Jonah, first name, on his quarterdeck, like it belonged there. 16 degrees, 40 minutes. 16 degrees, 40 minutes. He watched her go. Perfect. She disappeared below. He stood on his quarterdeck with the taste of her on his mouth and the stars wheeling overhead and the ship driving toward Boston at full pressure, and he understood, with the clarity that only comes after you've stopped fighting, that the sea had always been enough because he'd never known what he was missing. Now he knew, and he was never going to unknow it. Chapter 7. Emma woke with the taste of him on her mouth. Not literally. Hours had passed. She'd slept. She'd dreamed about something involving the sextant and a teacup that made no sense. But the first thing her body registered before her mind caught up was the memory of his lips on hers, his hands in her hair, the sound she'd made against his mouth that she would never, ever be able to take back. She lay in her bunk staring at the low ceiling and touched her lips with her fingertips like a girl in one of Rose's novels, and she didn't care. She was 29 years old, and she was lying in a ship's bunk grinning at the ceiling, and she was absolutely, irrevocably ridiculous. The knock came at 7:15. "Emma," Rose's voice, bright and barely contained. "Are you awake?" "I'm awake." The door opened. Rose took one look at her face and grabbed Emma's shoulders with both hands. "You kissed him." "I am not." "You kissed him." "Oh my God, Emma, you kissed him. I can see it on your face. You look like you've been, oh my God." Rose shut the door behind her and pressed her back against it, bouncing on her toes, barely breathing. "Tell me everything. Tell me right now, or I will die on this spot." "I'm not telling you anything. Your face is telling me everything. You're glowing. Emma Lane, I have known you my entire life, and I have never once seen you glow." Rose's grin was so wide it looked painful. Was it wonderful? It was wonderful. Look at you. It was wonderful. Emma pressed her palms to her cheeks, which were burning. "Rose, please." "Was it on the quarterdeck, under the stars, with the sextant?" Rose spun once, arms out as though the corridor cabin were a ballroom. "Oh, that's unbearably romantic. Kate is going to lose her mind. Can I tell Kate?" "You absolutely cannot tell Kate. Kate will put it in her notebook." "Kate puts everything in her notebook. That's what makes her Kate." Rose crossed the cabin in 2 steps and sat on the edge of Emma's bunk. "Emma, I'm so happy I could burst. You deserve this. You deserve someone who looks at you the way he does." Emma's throat went tight. She reached for Rose's hand and squeezed it once, hard, because words would have undone her entirely. "Now get dressed." Rose stood, smoothing her skirt with brisk authority. "And do something with your hair. You look like you've been kissed on a quarterdeck." "I hate you." "You love me. Get dressed." The day was exquisite torture. Emma had spent 12 years navigating the invisible architecture of the Sterling household. Where to stand, how to speak, when to be present, and when to vanish. She could manage a dinner for 20, coordinate the logistics of an international crossing, and smooth over any social catastrophe with the right word at the right moment. None of that training had prepared her for the challenge of sitting across a breakfast table from a man she'd kissed senseless the night before and pretending she didn't know what his mouth tasted like. He was at the captain's table for the morning meal. She was seated between Rose and Maggie. The saloon was full, all 3 families, the older children, the hum of conversation, and the clink of cutlery. Perfectly ordinary, perfectly public. She reached for the tea, and her eyes found his across the room. He was already looking. The heat went through her so fast she nearly dropped the pot. He held her gaze for 1 second. Just one, barely enough for anyone to notice, and the corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile, the ghost of one. She poured her tea with a hand that was steadier than she deserved, and did not look at him again for the rest of the meal. She did not need to. She could feel him there like a lamp burning at the edge of a room. Rose, beside her, made a small sound that might have been a cough and was definitely a laugh. At midday, she crossed the main deck carrying a stack of books back to the ship's library. Novels Maggie had finished, a navigation text she no longer needed the excuse of borrowing. He was at the port rail reviewing a chart with his first mate. She passed within 3 feet of him. His hand hanging at his side, brushed her fingers as she went by, just barely, just enough. She kept walking. She was halfway to the library before she realized she'd pressed her own fingers together, holding the sensation there, and she had to stop in the corridor and close her eyes and breathe. Their second night. She climbed onto the quarterdeck at 9, punctual this time because she'd learned her lesson about making a man wait, and also because she physically could not have stayed below a minute longer. He was at the rail. The sextant was in its case. Neither of them reached for it. "I brought a blanket." She held it up. "The deck is cold." "The deck is always cold." "Yes, and I've been sitting on it for 4 nights pretending it wasn't, so..." She spread the blanket against the bulkhead and sat down, tucking her skirt around her legs. After a moment, he sat beside her, close, his shoulder warm against hers. He told her about the first captain who'd been kind to him, a Scotsman named MacLeod, who'd found a 12-year-old stowaway in the hold, and instead of putting him off at the next port, had handed him a mop and said, "You'll earn your passage or you'll swim." How MacLeod had taught him to read charts, to take a star reading, to see the mathematics underneath the waves. How he died of fever off the coast of Gibraltar when Jonah was 17, and Jonah had stood on deck and understood for the first time that the sea took everything and gave nothing back, and you loved it anyway. She told him about the first book she'd ever read in the Sterling Library. She was 8, newly arrived, still flinching at sudden sounds. Amelia had left her alone in the library, deliberately, Emma realized years later, and she'd pulled a book from the lowest shelf because it had a blue spine, and blue was the color of the sky through the window of the room she'd shared with 14 other girls at St. Margaret's. It was a book of maps, not stories. Maps, the whole world laid out in ink and color, and she'd sat on the floor of Clarendon House and traced the coastlines with her finger and thought, there are places. There are so many places. That was when I understood, she said. Her voice was quiet. The ship rocked gently beneath them. That the world was bigger than what I'd been given. That there were things beyond the next room and the next meal, and hoping someone would come back for me. He didn't say anything. He shifted closer so that his arm pressed fully against hers, solid and warm, and that was better than any words he could have found. They sat like that, the whole sides of their bodies touching, the stars wheeling slowly overhead. Until the watch changed and Emma reluctantly admitted that she needed to sleep at some point during this crossing. She went below, smiling. She fell asleep warm. She woke up laughing at nothing, and Rose took one look at her and said, "This is getting disgusting and I love it." Their third night. She stepped onto the quarterdeck and he was there, leaning against the rail, arms crossed, watching her come up the companionway steps with an expression that made her heart do something structurally unsound. "Good evening, Miss Lane." "Good evening, Captain Hale." He pushed off the rail, crossed the deck. His hand found her waist, easy, certain, as though he'd been doing it for years, and he kissed her, warm, unhurried, his mouth on hers like a question he already knew the answer to, his thumb tracing a slow circle on her hip through the fabric of her dress. She leaned into him and kissed him back and thought, This is what it feels like when something belongs to you. He pulled back just enough to look at her. Hello. You're on time tonight. I've been ready since breakfast." He laughed. That rough, low sound she was beginning to know the way she knew the stars he'd taught her. Each one slightly different, each one hers. They sat on the blanket she'd brought. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into his shoulder, and the quarterdeck was theirs. "Can I ask you something?" His voice was low, rumbling through his chest into her ear. "You can ask me anything. Your surname, Lane." A pause. "You told me about St. Margaret's, about the Sterlings taking you in, but you never said how you got there, to the orphanage." She pulled the blanket tighter around her knees. "You don't have to tell me." "No, I want to." She did. She'd told him about the orphanage, about the fever, about the family that saved her. But she'd never given him this piece, the one underneath all the others, the foundation. She sat up so she could see his face. The stars were bright and the binnacle lamp cast warm light across his features. And she thought, if I can't tell him, I can't tell anyone. "I was found in a lane. I don't know which one. I was old enough to know my name was Emma, but that's all I had. I don't remember my parents. I don't remember how I got there or who left me or why." She kept her voice level, just the facts. "The orphanage gave me the surname, Lane, because it was the only thing they knew about where I'd come from." He was quiet. She watched his face and saw nothing that looked like pity, only attention, steady and complete, the same focus he brought to a star reading or a difficult heading. "My whole name," she said, "is a first name I arrived with and a street I was found on. That's it. That's everything I started with." He reached for her hand, turned her palm up in his and traced the lines there with his thumb, reading her the way he read the sea. "The name is just the name, Emma. You're everything you built after." She leaned forward and kissed him, softly, tasting the salt on his lips and the kindness underneath and thinking, this man, this impossible, rough-voiced, steady-handed man who sees me as someone who built something instead of someone who was left behind. They stayed on the quarterdeck until the stars shifted. She kissed him goodnight, his jaw, the corner of his mouth, then his mouth properly, long and slow, and went below. In her cabin, in the dark, she lay in her bunk and let her body feel what it was feeling, the warmth that hadn't faded, the looseness in her chest where the tightness usually lived, the way her breathing came easy and deep, as though something that had been clenched for years had finally uncurled. 4 days to Boston. He'd said he had 14 days in port. She was already imagining it, Jonah on solid ground, Jonah in a city, Jonah showing her streets she'd never walked, their first time on land together. The thought felt like the beginning of something. She pressed her fingers to her lips and smiled in the dark and let the ship carry her toward it. Chapter 8. Jonah Hale was losing command of himself. Not of the ship. The Heiress ran true, engines at full pressure, the northern approach to Boston mapped and recalculated twice daily. The coal margins were tight but holding. The weather was fair. The crew was sharp. On paper, Captain Hale was performing exactly as William Sears expected. But Captain Hale kept looking at the main deck. He looked at the main deck when she crossed it in the morning with her arms full of books. He looked when she sat with Rose and Maggie at the noon meal and said something that made them both laugh. He caught himself watching when she stood at the rail in the late afternoon, with the wind pulling at her hair, reading, not knowing she was being watched, or maybe knowing and letting him look anyway, which was worse, because it meant she trusted him with the looking. His first mate, Henderson, had noticed. Henderson was a careful man who'd served under Jonah for 3 years and had never once commented on anything that wasn't directly related to the running of the ship. On the morning of the 4th day after the kiss, Henderson handed Jonah the coal report and said, without looking up, "Fair weather holding, Captain. Clear skies tonight." "Thank you, Mr. Henderson. Should be a fine evening on the quarterdeck for anyone who happens to be there." Jonah took the coal report. "That will be all, Mr. Henderson." Henderson's mouth didn't move. His eyes did. He went below. Jonah stood at the helm and thought about how a man could command a ship across the Atlantic and navigate by the stars and calculate a fuel margin to the hundredweight, but could not, apparently, keep his crew from knowing he was in love. The word arrived without permission. He let it sit. In love. With the governess. With a woman who'd been found in a lane and raised in a collapsing orphanage, and educated by the family she served, and who kissed him like she'd been waiting her whole life to stop being careful. With Emma Lane, who read maps on library floors and talked boys down from rigging and learned the stars because he'd offered to teach her, and then learned them so fast he'd run out of things to teach. He was in love with her. The admission didn't feel like a storm or a revelation. It felt like checking a heading he'd been sailing for days and finding he was exactly where he thought he was. The problem was Boston. 4 days. They had 4 days left of open water, and then a harbor, and then he sails, she stays, and that's the end of it. 14 days in port. He kept coming back to that number. 14 days when the ship resupplied and he wasn't a captain. 14 days to walk beside her on streets instead of decks, to learn who she was on solid ground, to find out if this thing they'd built between navigation readings and blankets on the quarterdeck could survive without the ocean holding them together. It had to be enough. He'd make it enough. Their 4th night. She brought the blanket. He brought a second one, stolen from his own cabin, because the quarterdeck was cold, and she'd been pretending it wasn't for a week, and he was done watching her shiver. 2 blankets. She looked at him. "We're getting domestic. We're getting practical. You were cold last night. I wasn't cold. You were warm. There's a difference." She spread both blankets against the bulkhead. They sat. His arm went around her, and she leaned into him, and the ease of it, the way their bodies had learned each other's angles, still caught him off guard. 6 years of command, and nothing had ever felt as natural as Emma settling against his shoulder. The sky was enormous, no moon. The stars were so bright they cast shadows on the deck. If you could do anything, her voice was quiet, her head against his chest. If none of it mattered, the money, the position, the practical everything, what would you do? He almost deflected. The question was the kind that required you to say the thing you wanted most, and saying it out loud made it real, and real things could be lost. "My own ship." She tilted her head to look at him. "Tell me." Small. Fast, not a passenger liner, cargo. Maybe the Atlantic run, maybe further south, the Mediterranean, West Africa. He could see it. He'd always been able to see it. The way you see a star you've been navigating toward for years. Out of Liverpool, answering to no one. Choosing my own routes, my own cargo, my own crew. What would you call her? He looked down at her. I haven't thought about it. You're a terrible liar, Jonah Hale. He laughed. The MacLeod. After the captain who found me in his hold and handed me a mop instead of throwing me overboard. She smiled. The real one, the one that cracked her composure and showed everything underneath. That's perfect. She was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing a pattern on his chest that he suspected she didn't know she was doing. Your own ship, your own routes. You'd be good at that. I'd be good at that. He'd never said it before, not to anyone. His voice came out rough, almost embarrassed, and he looked away toward the horizon before he looked back. Saying it out loud to Emma felt like plotting a course he'd been afraid to chart. Your turn. He tightened his arm around her. If you could do anything. She didn't answer immediately. He felt her breathing change, a slight catch, the kind that meant she was thinking about something she hadn't fully formed yet. A school. He waited. For girls like me. The words came slowly, as though she were discovering them as she spoke. Girls who came from lanes and orphanages and workhouses. Girls with no name and no family and no one who expected anything from them. Her fingers had stopped moving on his chest. Not a charity school. Not needlework and scripture and how to curtsy to your betters. A real school. Navigation, mathematics, commerce, how to read a contract, how to manage accounts, how to look at a map and understand that the world is bigger than the room you're standing in. Like St. Margaret's, what Amelia built. Yes, but for girls who have nothing, girls who need it most. She sat up so she could face him. Her eyes were bright and her voice had changed, quicker, urgent the way it got when she forgot to be composed. Amelia saved that orphanage. She fought for it. She found the building. She turned it into a real school, and I was one of the girls she saved. I've spent 12 years being grateful for it, and I've never once tried to do the same for someone else. She pulled her knees up, wrapped her arms around them. I could teach them. I know how to teach. It's the one thing I'm actually good at, and I could teach them the things that matter. Not what fork to use, how to survive, how to be something. He watched her face as she talked and saw the idea taking shape in real time. Not a plan, not yet, just the bright, hot core of a thing she'd been carrying without knowing it. She started building it in the air between them, and he helped. You'd need a building, something near the docks, cheaper rents, closer to the girls who'd need it. Near the docks, she nodded. And I'd need books, proper ones, charts, navigation texts, arithmetic. I could bring you books. Every port I touched, Boston, Lisbon, wherever. I'd bring back whatever you needed. You'd be my supplier. I'd be your shipping line, he grinned at her. The MacLeod, delivering educational contraband to Miss Lane's school for terrifying young women. She laughed, a bright, startled sound that rang across the quarterdeck and into the dark. Miss Lane's school for terrifying young women. That's appalling. I love it. It wants a proper name. Everything wants a proper name. I wanted a proper name. They gave me Elaine. She said it lightly, almost laughing, and he marveled at that, at the way she could take the hardest thing about herself and offer it up like loose change. They kept building. She'd teach navigation. He'd bring her a sextant. She'd teach mathematics. He'd find her the texts MacLeod had used on him. She'd teach the girls to read stars. And someday one of those girls might stand on a quarterdeck and take a reading and know that the sky was hers as much as anyone's. Where? He was lying on his back now, her head on his chest, both of them looking up at the stars. Where would you build it? She was quiet. Then, I don't know yet, London maybe, that's where the need is greatest. London's expensive. Everything's expensive when you have nothing. She said it without self-pity, just fact. Then she grinned. I suppose I'd have to start small. One room, one sextant, a very determined woman and a chalkboard, and a shipping line that brings you books from every port. The worst shipping line in the world. One ship, one captain. Extremely unreliable delivery schedule. The MacLeod delivers on time. The MacLeod is a professional operation. The MacLeod doesn't exist yet. Neither does your school. We're dreaming. Let me have my ship." She laughed and pressed her face into his shoulder, and he felt the vibration of it through his whole body. "Fine. You can have your ship, but I get first priority on cargo space. Books before tobacco. Books before everything." He pressed his lips to the top of her head. She tilted her face up, kissed him once, soft and lingering, and the conversation dissolved into something that didn't need words. Later, much later, when the stars had shifted and the air had cooled and they were both slightly drunk on each other and the scale of what they'd imagined, she said, "Will you show me Boston? 14 days. Neither of us has ever been anywhere in Boston that isn't a dock. Then we'll get lost together." She traced the line of his jaw with her thumb. "Properly lost. No charts, no headings, just walking until we find something worth finding." That sounds like a terrible navigation strategy. It sounds like an adventure. You could use one that doesn't involve rigging. He kissed her, and she laughed against his mouth, and he thought, 14 days. I can build the beginning of something in 14 days. William's knock came at 11:30, after Emma had gone below, after the quarterdeck had emptied, after Jonah had stood at the rail for a long time looking at the stars and feeling like a man who'd found a heading he wanted to follow for the rest of his life. "Captain." A word. William looked tired. He always looked tired now, the constant quiet erosion of a man running out of time. But tonight there was something else, a tightness around his mouth that Jonah recognized as the expression William wore when he was about to ask for something he didn't want to ask for. "Come in." William sat. Jonah's cabin was small, charts on the table, a narrow bunk, the sextant case on the shelf, a captain's quarters on a ship that wasn't his. William looked at the charts and rubbed his face with both hands. "I need the Heiress in Norfolk. There's a tobacco consignment, contracted 6 months ago. The buyers are expecting delivery before the new year. Father arranged it before he..." William stopped, started again. "The cargo's sitting in a warehouse in Norfolk, and the ship that was meant to collect it went down off Cape Hatteras in October. I need you to run south from Boston, collect the shipment, and bring it back." Jonah's hands went still on the table. "When?" "2 days after we dock. 3 at most. I'm sorry, Jonah. I know you were expecting time in port. 2 days, not 14. 2 days in Boston and then south to Virginia, and the 14 days he'd been counting on, the streets, the getting lost, the beginning of something, collapsed into 48 hours. How long is the Norfolk run? 2 weeks, maybe 3, depending on weather. You'd be back in Boston in time to take the families home to Liverpool." William hesitated. "I wouldn't ask if there were another option, but Father's contracts are the business can't afford to lose this one. Not now." Jonah understood. The Sears shipping line was William's inheritance, and Josiah was dying, and the contracts had to be honored or the whole enterprise would start to crack. This wasn't a request. It was the job. "Of course." His voice came out steady, professional. "I'll have the crew ready." William stood. "Thank you." He paused at the door. "I know this isn't what you planned." "It's the job, sir." William nodded and left. Jonah sat in his cabin. The charts were spread before him, the northern approach to Boston that he'd been refining for days, the harbor he'd been planning to walk with Emma, the city he'd promised to get lost in with her. He pulled a fresh chart from the shelf. The Atlantic coast, Boston to Norfolk. He traced the route with his finger, south past Cape Cod, through the Sound, down the coast past New York and the Chesapeake to the Virginia Capes. 2 weeks of open water. 2 weeks away from a woman who was sleeping one deck below him, still believing they had 14 days. She didn't know yet. She was down there in her cabin, one deck below him, still believing they had 14 days, still planning the streets they'd walk and the getting lost together and the beginning of something she thought they had time to build. He didn't know how to tell her. He didn't know how to say, "The 14 days are gone and I'm sailing south and the school and the ship and everything we built on that quarterdeck was a dream, and dreams don't survive docking." Except he didn't believe that. That was the worst part. That was the worst believe. It was just a dream. The McLeod was real. Her school was real. The way she'd looked when she said navigation, mathematics, commerce, that was the most real thing he'd ever seen on a human face. 2 days. He had 2 days to show her Boston, and then he had to leave. Jonah folded the chart, put it on the shelf, lay down in his narrow bunk, and stared at the ceiling. 2 hours ago, she'd been building a school in the air between them, and he'd been helping her build it. And the whole time, Boston had been getting closer, and Norfolk had been waiting, and he hadn't known yet, but the ocean had. The ocean always knew before he did, and it always took what it wanted. Chapter 9. He found her in the corridor before breakfast. She was carrying a stack of folded linens, still the governess, still managing, even with Boston Harbor visible through every porthole. And he stepped out of the companionway and said her name, and she knew from the way he said it that something had changed. Norfolk. Mr. Sears needs the Heiress for a cargo run. 2 days after we dock. Emma's hands tightened on the linens. 2 days. Tobacco shipment. The vessel that was meant to collect it went down in October. There's no other ship available. His jaw was tight. His voice was the professional one, Captain Hale delivering a report. But his eyes were wrong. 2 weeks, maybe 3. I'll be back in time to take the families to Liverpool. She did the arithmetic without wanting to. 2 days in Boston. Then he sails. The 14 days they'd been counting on. The getting lost, the walking, the beginning, replaced by 48 hours. When did you find out? Last night. After you went below. So she'd fallen asleep planning the streets they'd walk, and he'd been one deck below staring at charts to Norfolk. He'd sat with it alone all night. Well, she shifted the linens in her arms, straightened. Then we'd better make the most of the time we have. Something moved across his face that she couldn't quite read. She didn't examine it. She stepped past him and walked to the linen cupboard and put the towels away with hands that were almost steady. And then she went to breakfast and sat between Rose and Maggie and ate toast she couldn't taste and did not look at the captain's table once. Rose noticed anyway. What's wrong? Nothing. Pass the jam. Boston was chaos and cobblestones and more noise than Emma had heard in 3 weeks. The dock was a wall of sound after the muffled world of the ship. Gulls and shouting and the groan of ropes and the clatter of wagons on stone. Families poured off the gangplank into the arms of people waiting. Jacob and Sophia Livingston were there, tanned and paint-stained and surrounded by American-born children who stared at their English cousins with frank curiosity. Sophia grabbed every sterling she could reach. Jacob stood back, grinning, his easel-calloused hands shoved in his pockets. William and Lucy went straight to their father's house. Charlotte held William's arm. Marcus held Lucy's. The older generation moved in a tight, quiet formation, grief pulling them one direction, the city pulling them another. Rose took charge of the younger cousins without being asked. She simply did it. Gathered the Livingston children, and the Sterling children, and the Pembry children into a group and marched them toward the waiting carriages with the natural authority of a woman who'd been watching Emma do it for years and had learned every trick. Emma stood on the dock and watched Rose manage it all and thought, she doesn't need me anymore. None of them do. The thought didn't hurt the way it had at the beginning of the crossing. It was just true. Jonah found her. He'd changed out of his captain's coat the first time she'd seen him in anything other than uniform, and the sight of him in a plain dark jacket on a cobblestone street made her breath catch. He looked different on land, broader, looser, the set of his shoulders easier without the uniform holding him in place. I have 48 hours, he held out his hand. I know the harbor and the streets around the customs house. After that, you're on your own. She took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm, certain, calloused. The first time they'd held hands in daylight. The first time anyone could see. Show me everything you know. We'll figure out the rest. He walked her through the harbor district, the wharves he docked at, the chandlers and warehouses and counting houses that lined the waterfront. He pointed out the different rigs in the harbor the way other men might point out architecture. The Baltimore Clipper with her raked masts, the packet ships, the broad-beamed cargo vessels that made the Atlantic run. His voice changed when he talked about ships. Looser, younger. She'd never heard him sound like that. They walked until the streets he knew ran out and the city became unfamiliar to both of them. They found a market, and he bought her coffee from a street vendor. She watched him taste it and make a face that she wished someone would paint. They found a bookshop and spent an hour in it, and he bought a navigation text and handed it to her and said, "For the school," as though it were already real. She held the book against her chest and felt the dream on the quarterdeck putting down roots. They found a bench by the harbor and sat and watched the ships come in, and she leaned against his shoulder and thought, this is what it would be like, this ordinary, impossible thing, walking through a city with someone, learning what they notice, watching them be themselves on solid ground. He kissed her on that bench, in daylight, in public, his hand on her jaw, his mouth warm, the taste of terrible American coffee between them. A woman walking past tutted. Emma didn't care. Not today, not on this bench, not with his mouth on hers. They had 2 days. They used them. The morning he sailed, she stood on the dock. The Heiress was loaded and crewed and ready. The harbor was gray, early, cold, the kind of morning that made you pull your coat tighter and wish for tea. Jonah was on the quarterdeck in his captain's coat, back in uniform, back in the shape of the man who commanded ships and followed orders. The distance between the dock and the quarterdeck was 30 feet, and it felt like the Atlantic. He came down, crossed the gangplank, stood in front of her on the cobblestones with his hands in his pockets and his jaw tight. 2 weeks. 2 weeks. She kept her voice even. She was good at this. She hated that she was good at this. I'll be back. We'll take the families to Liverpool and then what? He didn't answer. She hadn't expected him to. There was no answer, not yet, not one either of them could see. He goes back to sea. She goes back to England. The crossing ends, and the real world reassembles itself, and the quarterdeck becomes just a quarterdeck again. Emma. He took his hands out of his pockets, took her face in his hands, rough palms, gentle pressure, his thumbs on her cheekbones. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to leave and come back. I've only ever known how to leave. Then learn. She put her hands over his, held them there. You learned the stars. You can learn this. He kissed her, hard, brief. Then he dropped his hands and walked back up the gangplank and didn't turn around. She stood on the dock and watched the Heiress pull away from the wharf. Watched the water widen between the hull and the stone. Watched until the ship cleared the harbor mouth and the sails caught, and the distance became the kind you couldn't close by walking. Her hands were shaking. She put them in her pockets. I always want what I can't have. She said it to no one, to the harbor, to the ship getting smaller against the gray horizon. That's not true. Emma turned. Amelia was standing behind her, coat buttoned, hair pinned against the wind, the quiet, steady presence that had been the fixed point of Emma's life since she was 8 years old. It's not what you can't have, Emma. It's what you won't let yourself reach for. He's sailing to Norfolk. He'll be gone for weeks. He'll be back. And then he sails again. That's what he does. That's who he is. Emma's voice cracked, just slightly, just enough to hear. And I'll be back at Clarendon House, folding linens and managing the diary and being useful. And this will be something that happened on a ship once. Amelia was quiet for a moment. The gulls screamed. The harbor moved with the slow business of a working morning. Boats loading, men shouting, the world carrying on. Do you remember when I found you in the library? Amelia said. Your first week at Clarendon House. You'd pulled a book off the bottom shelf, the atlas with the blue spine. I remember. You were sitting on the floor tracing the coastlines with your finger. You were 8 years old and you'd just survived a collapsing building and a fever that nearly killed you, and you were sitting on my library floor looking at maps of places you'd never seen. Amelia stepped closer. I told Nathaniel that night, that girl is going to do something extraordinary, and our job is to make sure nobody stops her. Emma's eyes burned. Amelia, you are allowed to want things. Amelia's voice was firm and soft at the same time, the way it always was when she meant something absolutely. You are allowed to want a life that isn't in service to mine. The children. Emma, Amelia took her hands. We didn't take you in to look after the children. We took you in because you were a child who needed a family. You are our family. You always have been. And the children will be fine. Rose is already doing everything you do and doing it beautifully. And that's not a tragedy. That's what was supposed to happen. You raised her to be capable. Let her be capable. A tear slid down Emma's cheek. The harbor was blurring. I think I want to open a school. The words came out before she'd planned them, raw, unfinished, the same way they'd come out on the quarterdeck under the stars. But they sounded different on solid ground. They sounded real. For girls like me, orphans, girls who came from nothing, I'd teach them navigation, mathematics, how to read a contract, how to look at a map and see that the world is bigger than the room they're standing in. She wiped her cheek with the back of her hand. I know it sounds mad. Amelia's face changed. Not surprise, recognition. The look of a woman who'd spent her life fighting for an orphanage and funding a school, watching one of those girls stand on a dock and say, I want to do what you did. It sounds, Amelia said carefully, like the least mad thing you've ever said. I don't have money. I don't have a building. You have us. Amelia squeezed her hands. You have always had us. And Nathaniel will fall over himself to help. You know how he gets about education. He'll want to fund the whole thing before you've finished the sentence. Emma laughed, a wet, shaky sound that was half sob. I can't take your money. You can, and you will, and you'll consider it 20 years of back wages for services rendered to the most chaotic family in England. Amelia's eyes were bright. Where? Have you thought about where? London, I suppose. That's where the need. London has quite a few schools. Amelia said it lightly, almost too lightly. Good ones, actually. Plenty of people doing that work already. Emma looked at her. I hear Liverpool could use a school. Amelia held her gaze. Steady. Innocent. Not innocent at all. Terrible shortage of educational options in Liverpool. Huge port city. Enormous population of girls who need exactly what you're describing. And as I understand it, a certain captain makes port there every 6 weeks or so. Amelia, I'm simply stating facts about Liverpool's educational landscape. You're not stating facts, you're matchmaking. I'm doing both. They're not mutually exclusive. Amelia released her hands and brushed a strand of hair from Emma's face, the gesture of a mother, the only mother Emma had ever known. Build your school, Emma. Build it somewhere that makes you happy. And if that somewhere happens to have a very good harbor, well, she smiled. That's just practical. Emma stood on the dock. The ship was gone. The harbor stretched out gray and wide and full of possibility. Behind her, the carriages waited to take the families to the Sears house. Ahead of her was something she couldn't quite see yet, but she could feel its shape. A building, a classroom, girls with nothing, learning everything, Liverpool stone under her feet, and the sound of ships in the harbor, and a man who came home every 6 weeks. She wiped her face, straightened her spine, turned to Amelia. Liverpool, she said. I think Liverpool. Amelia smiled like a woman who'd known the answer before she'd asked the question. Chapter 10. The Norfolk run took 17 days. Jonah sailed south from Boston on a Tuesday morning with a skeleton crew and an empty hold and a woman standing on a dock, getting smaller in the distance. He did not look back. He looked back. He looked back 3 times before the harbor mouth swallowed the city, and there was nothing left but open water and the work. The work was good. The work had always been good. The clean simplicity of command, the wind and the charts, and the 100 daily calculations that left no room for anything else. He drove the Heiress south past Cape Cod and through the Sound and down the coast, and he managed the loading in Norfolk and checked the tobacco and signed the contracts. And every night he stood on the quarterdeck and looked at the stars and the empty space at the rail where she should have been. He'd convinced himself it was over. Not bitterly, not the way a younger man would have, with anger or resentment or the satisfying fiction that it didn't matter. He'd convinced himself quietly, practically, the way a captain accepts a change in weather. The crossing had been extraordinary. She had been extraordinary. But the ship was the ship, and the ocean was the ocean, and he was a man who belonged to both. And Emma Lane was a woman who deserved more than 6 weeks of absence for every 2 weeks of presence. He sailed north. The tobacco sat in the hold, smelling of Virginia. The stars turned overhead. He thought about her constantly and told himself he wasn't. Boston Harbor. A gray morning. 17 days since he'd left. He brought the Heiress in clean, a textbook approach, the kind of docking that made Henderson nod once, which was the highest praise Henderson had ever given anything. The families were on the wharf, waiting, trunks and cases piled on the cobblestones, the Livingston children waving, the whole chaotic entourage reassembled for the return crossing. Jonah stood at the helm and scanned the dock. He found William first, then Charlotte, then Marcus and Lucy, Daniel and Caroline, the younger generation, James, Rose, Kate, Maggie, Alex, Bridie, Sean. He counted them the way he counted crew, present, accounted for, all in order. He found Emma last. She was standing at the edge of the group, her trunk beside her, and something was different. He couldn't place it immediately. She was dressed the same, practical, neat, but the way she was standing had changed. She wasn't positioned between the families and the children, managing the gap. She was standing apart, with her own luggage, her own space. Rose was managing the younger cousins. Rose was counting heads and directing porters and doing everything Emma had done on the Liverpool dock 3 weeks ago. And she was doing it well, and Emma was watching her do it with an expression Jonah couldn't read from this distance. He docked. He gave orders. He did the work of bringing a ship to rest. And then he went below because the gangplank was down, and the families were boarding, and Emma Lane was on his dock, and 17 days of convincing himself it was over had been obliterated by one look at her standing beside her own trunk. She found him on the quarterdeck an hour after they'd cleared the harbor. The families were settled below, cabins assigned, trunks stowed, the return crossing begun. The Atlantic stretched west behind them, Boston disappearing into the haze. Ahead, the ocean and Liverpool on the other side. She climbed the companionway steps and stopped at the top and looked at him across the deck. Her hair was pinned. Her dress was practical. But her eyes were different, steady and bright and open in a way he'd only seen on the quarterdeck at night when Miss Lane fell away and it was just Emma. "I'm not going back to Clarendon House." He stared at her. "When we dock in Liverpool, I'm staying. I'm opening a school." She crossed the quarterdeck toward him. "Steady, certain. Amelia and Nathaniel are helping me find a building and fund the start of it." He opened his mouth, closed it. "It's going to be in Liverpool," she said, "in case you were wondering." Liverpool. Liverpool. She stopped in front of him, close enough to touch. Large port city. Terrible shortage of schools, very good harbor. "I know what Liverpool is." "Good, because you'll be docking there every 6 weeks, and I expect you to bring me books." Something was breaking open in his chest, something he'd spent 17 days sailing south and 17 days sailing north trying to seal shut, and she was standing on his quarterdeck smiling at him, and it was all coming apart. Books. From every port. Navigation texts, arithmetic, maps, whatever you can find. "I told you, you're my shipping line." "The worst shipping line in the world. The only one I want." He pulled her to him. She came willingly, her hands on his chest, her face tilted up, that crooked, unguarded smile that broke every rule he'd ever set for himself about what a captain did on his own quarterdeck. He held her face in his hands and pressed his forehead against hers and breathed. "You built it." His voice was rough. "The school. You actually built it." "I'm building it. There's a difference. I don't even have a building yet." "You have an idea and a shipping line and a very good harbor. That's more than I had when I started." She laughed. He kissed her, not hard, not desperate, but deep and slow and full of everything he'd carried across the ocean. She kissed him back, and her hands slid up his chest to his shoulders, and she held on, and he held on, and the quarterdeck and the stars and the sextant in its case had brought them here, and he was never letting go. When they pulled apart, she was flushed and bright-eyed, and her hair was coming loose from its pins. "You can always visit me," she said, "when you're in port, between your captaining and your cargo and your busy life at sea, if you can find the time. I'll find the time." "You'll have to. I'm very busy. I'm opening a school." He grinned at her. She grinned back. The quarterdeck was theirs, and the Atlantic was ahead, and for the first time in his life, the voyage felt like the journey home. William called him to the saloon on the third day. Charts on the table. Not navigation charts, but shipping routes, ledgers, the commercial architecture of the Sears fleet. William looked tired, but steadier than he had on the outbound crossing. He'd seen his father. He'd said what needed to be said. The grief was there, but it had edges now, something he could carry instead of something that carried him. My father's affairs need restructuring. William folded his hands on the table. Businesslike. The fleet is expanding. I need someone in Liverpool to manage operations, schedules, crews, maintenance, contracts with the dockyards. Someone who knows ships and knows the port and can handle the work without me standing over his shoulder. Jonah waited. I want you to run the Liverpool office. The words settled into the cabin like an anchor finding the bottom. You'd still command. I'd need you on the Atlantic run regularly. The Heiress is yours as long as you want her. But Liverpool would be your home port. You'd oversee the fleet from there, manage the captains, handle the refit schedules. William paused. It pays considerably more than a single command. Enough to build something if a man were inclined. Jonah heard what William wasn't saying. William had eyes. He'd seen his captain cross a gangplank to stand with the governess on a Boston dock. He'd seen Emma board the return crossing with her own trunk and no duties. William Sears was a businessman, not a fool. I'd still sail. You'd still sail. I'd be a poor employer if I took the sea away from the best captain I've got. William allowed himself a small smile. But you'd come home, Jonah. That's the difference. You'd have somewhere to come home to. Jonah sat with it. The office, the fleet, Liverpool, where the ships came in and the docks stretched along the Mersey, and somewhere in a building that didn't exist yet, a woman was going to teach orphan girls to read the stars. I'd like to accept. I'd like you to accept. William stood, extended his hand. Welcome home, Captain. They shook. William left. Jonah sat in the saloon and looked at the charts and thought about Emma on a dock in Boston, saying, I think Liverpool and what it meant that she'd chosen to build her life in the city where his ship came home. Liverpool rose out of the morning mist on a Tuesday. The Mersey opened before them, gray and wide, the docks stretching along the waterfront. Factory smoke and church spires, and the dense, busy sprawl of a city that lived by its harbor. Emma stood at the rail. She'd spent the crossing differently. No linens to fold, no children to manage. Rose had taken over, naturally and completely, and Emma had let her. She'd read books in the mornings. She'd sat on deck in the afternoons. She'd come to the quarterdeck every evening and taken star readings that were nearly as good as his, and they'd talked about the school the way other people talked about weather, constantly, easily, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. She'd named it. Not Miss Lane's school for terrifying young women, though he'd argued for it. Something simpler. Something that said what it was. The Heiress docked, lines secured, gangplank down, the families gathered on deck with their trunks and their coats. Jonah watched the goodbyes from the quarterdeck. Rose first. She grabbed Emma and held on. Long, fierce, her face pressed into Emma's shoulder. When she pulled back, her cheeks were wet and her chin was set, and she was trying very hard to be brave about this. Emma held Rose's face in her hands and said something he couldn't hear, and Rose nodded and wiped her eyes, and then looked up at the quarterdeck and found Jonah and gave him a look that managed to convey, in a single glance, both absolute approval and the clear promise of grievous harm if he did anything wrong. Amelia was next. She embraced Emma, and neither of them moved for a long time. When Amelia pulled back, she was smiling, but her eyes were bright, and she held Emma by the shoulders and said something, and Emma's face crumpled, just for a moment, just a flash of something raw and overwhelmed, before she nodded and pressed her hand to Amelia's cheek. The gesture was so tender that Jonah had to look away. Nathaniel pressed an envelope into Emma's hand. She tried to push it back. Nathaniel fixed her with a look that Jonah recognized, the same look he'd seen at the captain's table when someone tried to argue with Lord Clarendon about policy. Emma stopped pushing. She took the envelope. Nathaniel said something short and gruff, and Emma laughed through tears and put her arms around his neck and the old man's face. For just a moment, lost every ounce of its aristocratic composure. Charlotte squeezed Emma's hand. Marcus said something stiff that made Emma smile. Daniel clapped her shoulder and said something that made her laugh. Breedy turned away sharply and then turned back and hugged her hard. Sean shook her hand with his father's gravity. Kate presented her with a notebook and said something practical that made Emma stare at it, and then stare at Kate, and then clutch the notebook to her chest. James hugged her, briefly, awkwardly, and said something Jonah couldn't catch. Maggie pressed a folded paper into her hand. The families boarded the waiting coaches, trunks loaded, doors closed. Jonah watched Emma stand on the Liverpool dock and watch the people who had been her whole world climb into carriages and prepare to leave without her. Amelia's face appeared at the coach window. She didn't wave. She smiled, and Emma smiled back, and then the coach pulled away, and the Sterling family disappeared down the Liverpool road. Emma stood on the dock, her trunk beside her, her back straight, her face wet, alone. Jonah handed the helm to Henderson. "Sir, you have command, Mr. Henderson." Henderson looked at the dock, looked at Emma, looked back at Jonah. His mouth didn't move. His eyes did. "Aye, Captain." Jonah crossed the gangplank. His boots hit the cobblestones. She turned at the sound, her eyes red, her nose red, her hair escaping its pins, and she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen on any ocean or any shore. "I hear Liverpool could use a school." She laughed. The sound was wet and bright, and it echoed off the stone. "I hear a certain captain is running the Sears office here. Fleet management. Very impressive." "Moderately impressive. He's also been told to bring books from every port. He'd better, the school's depending on it." He stepped closer, took her hand, the hand that had held a sextant, the hand that had rested on his chest on a quarterdeck under the stars, the hand that was going to build something. He kissed her. On the dock, in front of his crew and the gulls and the Liverpool morning. Not stolen, not hidden, not on a quarterdeck after dark, in the open, in daylight, at the beginning of everything. She kissed him back, and he thought, a heading, a harbor, a home. When they pulled apart, she picked up her trunk. He reached for it. "I can carry my own trunk." "I know you can." "Then why are you?" "Because I'd like to walk beside you, if that's all right." She looked at him. Then she let him take the trunk, not because she couldn't carry it. He knew that. Emma Lane could carry anything. She'd been carrying things her whole life. But she let him take it, and that was its own kind of brave. They turned away from the dock, the Mersey at their backs, Liverpool ahead of them, the streets, the buildings, the school that didn't exist yet but would, the sound of the harbor fading behind them, and the city opening up. Jonah Hale walked into Liverpool beside the woman he loved, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't heading out to sea. He was heading home. Thank you for reading A Captain Worth Finding. Emma's story began in A Gentleman's Gamble, American Heiress's Book 6, where a little girl named Emma stole the hearts of readers, and of Nathaniel and Amelia Sterling. If you haven't read How They Found Each Other, start there. The children Emma raised on this crossing, Rose, James, Kate, Sean, Bridie, and the rest, are all grown up and ready for their own love stories in Heirs of Defiance, a sweeping Victorian romance series coming soon. Their parents broke the rules. They'll rewrite them. Turn the page for a sneak peek at Heirs of Defiance Book 1, Rose Sterling's story. We hope you have enjoyed this presentation of A Captain Worth Finding, written by Violet Sinclair, narrated by Isadora Blythe.